VisualPolitik community, the United States has given Israel a first warning.
Biden says U.S. won't transfer offensive weapons if Israel invades Rafah.
For the first time since the war between Hamas and Israel broke out on 7th of October, the United States has made it clear that it is prepared to withdraw its support for the Jewish state, halting arms shipments if things get further out of control. The reason? The Israeli government is determined to invade Rafah, the southernmost town in the Gaza Strip, and the only one so far outside the effective control of the Israeli army. And what is so special about Rafah? Well, the reason why this operation has been so controversial internationally is that Rafah has received a huge number of displaced Palestinians, to the point that its population has increased tenfold. We're talking about the fact that half of the entire population of the Gaza Strip was in this city just prior to the announcement of the Israeli intervention. This means that about 1.3 million Gazans will have to leave for another safe place. The problem is that right now there is nowhere else in the Gaza Strip to go, at least nowhere that is not controlled by the Israeli army. At this point in time, Israeli troops have already taken control of the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, the last Gaza border they did not control. However, the land invasion at the time of making this video has not yet taken place. We're talking about an offensive that was being discussed just hours after ceasefire talks with Hamas in Cairo failed. Israel then began to ask the population of Rafah to evacuate Rafah in anticipation of an upcoming offensive. So what was the disagreement that led Israel to take this direction? Well, apparently, Israel wanted to leave operations in Rafah outside the ceasefire, and Hamas wanted to set conditions that Benjamin Netanyahu's government considered completely unacceptable, which should come as no surprise either. Following the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, the Israeli Prime Minister has been very clear.
עברנו להתקפה. כל איש חמאס הוא בן מוות. חמאס זה דאעש, ונרסק ונחסל אותו, כפי שהעולם ריסק וחיסל את דאעש.
And that's basically what he's doing. And if for now the Israelis are still agreeing to talk to Hamas, it's because Hamas is still holding 132 Israeli citizens hostage somewhere in the Strip. Be that as it may, the Israeli government's decisions and the way they are being executed are eroding international opinion that was initially favourable to them. After all, it's not really clear where they are headed beyond reducing the Gaza Strip to rubble, although we'll talk about that at length in an upcoming video here on VisualPolitik.
I'm hoping that the Israelis will not make any massive land invasion in the meantime. So it's my expectation that's not going to happen. There has to be a ceasefire temporarily to get those hostages.
We cannot afford an Israeli attack on Rafah. It is certain to produce another humanitarian catastrophe. The situation is already unbearable for over 1 million people.
The point for now is that Netanyahu doesn't seem to care about anything at all. He is not willing to change either the manner nor the ultimate goal of the war, which is the total annihilation of Hamas.
Defiant Netanyahu says Israel can stand alone after Biden's threat to withhold weapons.
So you see, Israel seems ready to go all the way. With the land invasion of Rafah, it would take full control of the Gaza Strip, something that Jerusalem sees as a symbol, as well as a clear turning point in this conflict. Why? Because according to Israel, hundreds and thousands of Hamas terrorists are hiding in this city, taking advantage of the chaos and the wave of refugees. Let's just say that they could have mixed with the civilian population so that once the Israelis leave, they will be able to control the entire strip again. And let me tell you, that is a real red line for the Israeli government. Not putting an end to Hamas, or at least to the political and military power of this organization, would be seen as a failure. And they may be correct there, but obviously the problem is that what we have in this city are, above all, civilians. Given all this, here on VisualPolitik, we've asked ourselves a few questions. What would the Israeli army's ground advance on Rafah really entail? Why does Netanyahu want to do it right now? What is the situation after more than 6 months of conflict? Could Rafah be the last major battle of this war? Well, we're going to look at all this right now and more coming up. And considering how fiery this topic is, and being one that will surely fall on us in comments, suit up and let's get started. To understand the mess the war with Hamas has become, let's first look at where exactly Rafah is, and why all of a sudden this city I'd never heard of is now making headlines around the world. Rafah is a town near the Gazan border with Egypt, which in turn is the most important crossing point for humanitarian aid. We're talking about basic supplies such as drinking water, food, medicine, and fuel. Therefore, one thing the international community fears is that the Israeli action will mean an extreme slowdown in the arrival of humanitarian aid as a consequence of the intervention itself. The checkpoints would be more heavily scrutinized, possibly even as a pressure magnet for Hamas to release hostages. Well, on 7th of May, the Israel Defense Forces ordered the evacuation of the city of Rafah, and so far, several medical centers and several humanitarian aid warehouses have been evacuated. By now, more than 100,000 Palestinians have already fled this city, although, as we said before, it is estimated that there are still more than 1 million people there. And naturally, the question is, where can you flee to when the rest of the Strip is already under Israeli control and is a war zone? Well, Jerusalem's idea is for them to evacuate to Han Yunis, a town just northeast of Rafah. The problem is that, according to several international agencies, the level of destruction in that town is too high to house all the people in Rafah in minimally reasonable conditions. But according to other Israeli voices, they are also trying to expand the Muwazi refugee camp, which is almost a 2-hour walk north of Rafah. In fact, according to the Netanyahu government, Israel has already prepared enough tents and field hospitals there to care for the displaced Palestinians. In any case, Gazans do not seem very willing to place themselves under the control of the Israeli army by fleeing to war zones, where clashes may break out street by street, or where Israel will screen the refugees very closely to try to detect Hamas members. Be that as it may, the point is that the situation from a humanitarian point of view is becoming untenable, and trying to move more than 1 million people who have been enduring the war for months now and keeping them away from aid inflows may be too much. This is precisely what explains Biden's ultimatum. If you invade Rafah, you can kiss our weapons goodbye. And it's not just the United States. There is a broad international consensus on this. Israel seems to have no clear exit plan, and its actions may come at too high a cost. And keep in mind that things could get worse. So far, the Arab countries have looked the other way, which in a way has been a great success for Netanyahu. But if things continue to escalate, it may be unfeasible for countries like Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia to remain silent. And to make matters worse, Israel is making it very difficult for Joe Biden, who, on the verge of the US presidential elections, is being forced to play a very difficult balancing act between supporting Israel and at the same time not scaring away the pro-Palestinian vote for the Democratic ranks. In other words, it's a mess for everyone. And let me stress, a mess with seemingly no exit plan or clear roadmap. But then why does Netanyahu want to play his most controversial card right at a time when the end of the war, or at least a ceasefire, seemed closer than ever? Could the Israeli government be entering a dead end? Well, let's take a look.
The final hours of Hamas?
It's strange that the side that starts a war and then loses is the one that most fervently asks for a truce, but not a truce designed to negotiate its surrender, but a truce with conditions. And the problem is that this is exactly what Hamas is doing, which, on top of everything, is not a state, but a terrorist group that has its sights set on wiping out Israel. A group, don't forget, that is armed and financed by an avowed enemy of Israel. I'm of course talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that is why in Israel they say that there could be no conditions, and that they will not accept to negotiate anything beyond a total surrender that will put an end once and for all to the political and military power of this terrorist group. This is, at least for now, the position of the Netanyahu government. And why do I say this? Because on 6th of May, Hamas announced that it had accepted a ceasefire proposal put forward by Egyptian and Qatari mediators. Although the details of the text have not been disclosed, some information gathered by international media, such as Al Jazeera, suggests that this agreement would have the following structure: a 3-stage process of 42 days each, which would begin with an initial ceasefire. Among other things, this first stage would include the dismantling of Israeli military installations in Gaza, although Hamas would be willing to allow the IDF to remain in parts of this Palestinian territory. In exchange, the Palestinian organization proposes to release 33 Israeli hostages, provided, however, that Israel releases between 30 and 50 Hamas prisoners for each Israeli civilian released. In other words, we're talking about the release of between 990 and 1,650 Palestinian prisoners. Then, in a second stage, Hamas would be demanding a total and permanent cessation of military activity in Gaza and the withdrawal of all Israeli forces. This has been interpreted in Israel as a proposal for Israel's surrender, and that is not the end of it. From day 85, Hamas proposes to exchange the remaining hostages in exchange for Israel's allowing an international plan for the reconstruction of Gaza over 3 to 5 years and an end to the siege of the Gaza Strip. We're talking about a plan that Netanyahu considers to be tailor-made for Hamas, and what can I say? On this point, he wouldn't be wrong. If this plan is confirmed, it would look more like a capitulation by Israel than a surrender by Hamas. So the question is, if we all know this is unacceptable, why is it on the table? Well, we could find many hypotheses, but a very clear one could be precisely to achieve what is already happening, to erode Israel's international image by portraying it as the country that does not accept a ceasefire, which is pretty clear from headlines like this one.
Israel rejects Hamas ceasefire offer.
The fact that it is the weaker side and the one that is clearly losing, but that is setting the conditions, seems to be something from another planet, but that's another debate. The point is that, as we already said, for Israel, the existence of Hamas has become totally unacceptable following 7th of October. For them, unless the organization is completely dismantled, Israel can no longer be considered a reasonably safe place to live, not to mention the sense of defeat that would accompany the operation and the government itself. Of course, it's also unclear what way out can be found. Paradoxically, it seems that support for Hamas has skyrocketed in Gaza during the war, and probably today many more men would be willing to join their ranks, seeking revenge once the conflict is over. And remember, this is no joke. Only 7% of Gazans blame Hamas for their current suffering. Even worse, just over 7 out of 10 Gazans continue to support Hamas's decision to launch the war against Israel with the 7th of October attack, while nearly 59% of Palestinians believe that Hamas should continue to rule in Gaza. Outrageous! And keep in mind, this is not Israeli data, but data from a survey conducted in March 2024 by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research itself. For all these reasons, Israel believes that Hamas's proposal is not sincere, and that it is only seeking to gain time to reorganize and rearm, and thus regain some control over the territory. As if that were not enough, the truce proposal would leave the political masterminds behind the attack of the 7th and the indiscriminate kidnapping of Israelis unpunished. We're talking about high-ranking politicians and even ministers in the Gaza government who have disappeared, and that Israel would have to accept being let off scot-free. But let me tell you, this does not fit well with Netanyahu's ideas.
We have to win. There is no substitute for victory. How do we achieve this victory? Hamas has to be eliminated. Not as an idea. Nazism wasn't destroyed as an idea in World War II, but Nazis do not govern Germany. There's still neo-Nazis around, but you destroyed that organization.
Now, don't think that his decision is coming without consequences for Netanyahu, both at home and abroad. Basically, imagine that if the kidnappers of your loved one offer, even if it is a bluff, to bring that person back home, you think of nothing else but that. So the pressure on the Israeli government, even from within the country, is increasing. Because there seems to be no exit plan, and because socially it is frowned upon for the government to reject the possibility of bringing home its own people. And VisualPolitik community, this attrition is probably another of the objectives pursued by the Hamas offer.
Biden said to tell Netanyahu ceasefire is best way to protect hostages. Thousands rally across Israel calling for Netanyahu to accept ceasefire deal.
The result is that all this has even led to an escalation of demonstrations, particularly in Tel Aviv, with the aim of pressuring the government to accept the ceasefire proposed by Hamas. That said, and now that this point has been made clear, the question is the war going so well for Israel that it refuses to accept a ceasefire? Is there a possibility that the Israeli government is determined to drag out something that is not going to bring it so many benefits? Well, the issue is far more complex than we can even imagine. Stay tuned.
Peace or government?
If we stick to the numbers, the current war between Israel and Hamas has been a real disaster. On 7th of October, terrorists killed nearly 1,200 people, as well as kidnapping approximately 250 others. Since then, the offensive unleashed by Hamas has resulted in an Israeli response that has caused enormous suffering and pain among the civilian population. According to Israeli military officials in statements to the Hebrew press, roughly 2 civilians are killed in their operations for every terrorist killed. This is a pretty unsustainable ratio, considering that Hamas may currently have some 40,000 active fighters, making the total eradication of its militants an exceedingly costly goal. Absolutely unacceptable. What's more, since the beginning of the Israeli operation, more than 250 Hebrew soldiers have lost their lives in ambushes inside Gaza. On top of that, the War Cabinet is considering the possibility of extending military service and conscription deadlines, thereby increasing the unpopularity of the war in certain sectors of Israel. To give you an idea, 70% of Israeli companies claim that their operations have been disrupted and damaged by the calling up of their employees. Nevertheless, despite the military, political, diplomatic, social, and even economic difficulties, of which we have spoken at length on our sister channel, VisualPolitik, a video that I'll link for you in the description, the truth is that the strategic results, apart from the costs, are reasonably good. So far, Israel has carried out operations in more than half of the Gaza Strip. The bulk of the offensive has been concentrated in a first phase in the north of the territory, around Gaza City. However, in recent weeks, operations have intensified in the southern half, culminating in capturing the Gaza-Egypt border, as we mentioned before. The north, center, and south of the territory have evacuation areas that have forced hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to move to shelters and camps along the coast. And take note, because even if they did not end up invading the whole of Rafah by land, the fact is that by controlling the Rafah crossing point, Netanyahu can boast of having Gaza almost in the palm of his hand.
בדרך לניצחון מוחלט. הניצחון הוא בהישג יד. זה לא עניין של שנים או עשרות שנים, זה עניין של חודשים.
However, you know what they say about wars. Everyone knows how to start them, but it's never clear how to end them. One way or another, Israel's victory seemed clear. The question is, what now? For Netanyahu, the war with Hamas is, at present, the only thing sustaining him politically, which may unfortunately cause the war to override humanitarian criteria. In fact, when all this is over, what likely awaits him is public defenestration and probably resignation. His recent authoritarian streaks and his mistakes on 7th of October have sunk his popularity. You could say that the war is the only thing that is lengthening his presidency for now. Remember that the current Israeli government is supported by a coalition of 64 seats, of which only 32 belong to Likud, Netanyahu's party. The rest are distributed in an amalgam of factions, dominated by an extreme religious Zionist right wing, which demands that he carry the war to its ultimate consequences.
Netanyahu's political survival in hands of far-right ministers, reliance on extremist allies such as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich distancing prime minister from Israeli public.
In view of that, the internal context of the government coalition is a real ticking time bomb. And of course, this situation in the middle of a war for which a way out has to be found could lead to terrible strategic mistakes. In fact, it cannot be ruled out that when Netanyahu does decide to accept a ceasefire, his ultra-nationalist partners will see a political vein for destroying the coalition. And this may also be affecting Israel's willingness to seek a way out of the conflict. Now, the question is, what is your opinion? What do you think the outcome in Rafah will be? Do you think we are closer to seeing a truce? Do you think Netanyahu may be delaying military operations to control his governing coalition? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very important, if you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Once again, thank you so very much for being there. All the best, see you next time.